Good morning. Today we will look at the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats by W.H. Auden. This poem is prescribed for the students of BA Part 3 English Literature in Paper 1. Before we look at the poem, let us look at the biography of W.H. Auden, the person, the poet who composed this poem in memory of W.B. Yeats. Biography of W.H. Auden. His dates are he was born in the year 1907 and he died in 1973. W.H. Auden was a British poet, author, and playwright, best known as a leading literary figure in the 20th century for his poetry. Who was W.H. Auden? W.H. Auden was poet, author, and playwright. Auden was a leading literary influencer in the 20th century. Known for his chameleon-like ability to write poems in almost every verse form, Auden's travels in countries torn by political strife influenced his early works. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1948. Auden's travels, his early life. W.H. Auden was born Wystan Hugh Auden in York, England on February 21st, 1907. Raised by a physician father and a strict Anglican mother, Auden pursued science and engineering at Oxford University before finding his calling to write and switching his major to English. Auden pursued his love of poetry, influenced by Old English verse and the poems of Thomas Hardy, Robert Frost, William Blake, and Emily Dickinson, all very popular writers of English literature. He graduated from Oxford in 1928, and that same year his collection Poems was privately printed. Career success. In 1930, with the help of T.S. Eliot, Auden published another collection of the same name, that is, poems, that featured different content. The success of this collection positioned him as one of the leading influencers in literature in the 20th century. Auden's poems in the latter half of the 1930s, means after 1935, reflected his journeys to politically torn countries. He wrote his acclaimed anthology. Anthology means a collection of poems, and acclaimed means very famous, very popular, much appreciated. And the title of that anthology was Spain, based on his first hand accounts of the country's civil war from 1936 to 1939. More so, Auden was lauded. Lauded means highly praised or admired. His chameleon like ability to write poems in almost every verse form. Now, chameleon एक जानवर होता है जिसको हम गिरगिट कहते हैं, जो रंग बदलता है. It's a type of small reptile that can change the color of its skin. His work influenced aspiring poets, popular culture, and vernacular speech. Vernacular means local speech. He stated in Squares and Oblongs essays based on the modern poetry collection at the Lockwood Memorial Library, 1948. And he says, a poet is long before anything else, a person who is passionately in love with language. ये ऑडन के खुद के शब्द हैं. After moving to America, Auden's work shifted away from political influences to instead reveal more religious and spiritual themes. Another time, a collection that debuted in America, debuted means that was introduced for the first time in America, features many of his most popular poems, including September 1st, 1939 and Musée des Beaux Arts. Now, September 1st, 1939 is an important date because this was the day when the Second World War started after some events had taken place. Accolades means an expression of praise. बहुत उनकी प्रशंसा हुई. Were given to Auden, including his 1948 Pulitzer Prize, which he won for The Age of Anxiety. Though best known for his poetry, Auden was also a distinguished playwright and author. Distinguished means highly respected playwright. He wrote plays also. Personal life. Auden wed Erika Mann, daughter of German novelist Thomas Mann, in 1935. The nuptial means the marriage did not last, as it was a marriage of convenience for her to gain British citizenship and flee Nazi Germany. Auden, ever the avid means very eager and enthusiastic traveller, visited Germany, Iceland and China, and then in 1939 moved to the United States. On this side of the pond, he met his other true calling, and that is his lifelong partner, fellow poet Chester Coleman. Auden eventually became an American citizen. With his health waning, means he becoming weak, Auden left America in 1972 and moved back to Oxford. He spent his last days in Austria, where he owned a house. Auden died in Vienna, Austria on September 29th, 1973. Now we'll look at the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats. I have given you the text of the poem. Please take a look at it. You have different sections, 1, 2, 3, 3 sections of the poem. Coming to the summary, analysis, etc. W.H. Auden, Poems, a Summary and Analysis of In Memory of W.B. Yeats. Introduction. W.B. Yeats dominated the 20th century literary scene for almost 40 years, right up until his death in 1939. In Memory of W.B. Yeats by W.H. Auden, who was born in 1907 and died in 1973, was written in 1939 following the death of the Irish poet W.B. Yeats in January of that year. As well as being an elegy, means an elegy is a poem or song that is written on the death of somebody. For the dead poet, In Memory of W.B. Yeats is also a meditation on the role and place of poetry in the modern world. What is poetry for? Can it make anything happen? Should it make anything happen? You can read In Memory of W.B. Yeats here before proceeding to the analysis below. Brief summary. William Butler Yeats died in winter. The brooks were frozen. Brooks means streams of water because it was bitterly cold. Airports were all but empty and statues were covered in snow. The thermometer and other instruments told us the day he died was a dark, cold day. These words are from the text. What While nature followed its course elsewhere, mourners kept his poems alive without letting the poet's death interfere. Yet, for Yeats himself, mind and body failed, leaving no one to appreciate his life but his admirers. He lives through his poetry, scattered among cities and unfamiliar readers and critics, who modify his life and poetry through their own understandings. While the rest of civilization moves on, a few thousand will remember the day of his death as special. In the second section of the poem, Yeats is called silly like us. It was mad Ireland that caused Yeats the suffering he turned into poetry. Poetry survives and gives voice to survival in a space of isolation. Isolation means when you are completely alone, separate from everybody else. In the third and final section of the poem, the poet asks the earth to receive Yeats as an honored guest. The body, emptied of its poetry, lies there. Meanwhile, the dogs of Europe bark and humans continue their intellectual disgrace. But the poet is to follow right to the bottom of the night, despite the dark side of humanity, somehow persuading others to rejoice in existence. Despite human unsuccess, the poet can sing through the curse and distress. Thus, one's poetry is a healing fountain that, although life is a prison, can teach the free man how to praise life anyway. Detailed summary. In Memory of W.B. Yeats is in three parts, each of which has its own form and style. Part 1. In the first section, W.H. Auden discusses the death of W.B. Yeats in the dead of winter. Well, Yeats did die in January after all, a time when the brooks were all frozen, that is, when the water in the flowing streams is frozen because of the cold, and snow made it difficult to make out the public statues. It was so cold the mercury in the thermometers dropped. As Yeats lay ill and dying, the world, and specifically Ireland, went on as usual, as if nothing had happened. A common theme of Auden's when dealing with death. Consider Musée des Beaux Arts, written just 1 month before Yeats died. When Yeats died, his death was kept from his poems. In other words, the poetry Yeats wrote remains unaltered, means unchanged by the fact that Yeats the man has now died. Auden then describes Yeats' death in the third stanza, concluding that with his passing, Yeats became his admirers. Once Yeats the man had ceased to be, means had stopped being. In other words, he was no longer alive. Yeats the poet became whatever his readers and fans decided he was. Here we can sense Auden making a broader point about the immortality of poets. They survive and don't survive depending on who reads them and how those readers read them. Yeats's work is scattered all over the world in those cities where people read them, often finding surprising things in his work which Yeats himself would not recognize, unfamiliar actions. Auden here is prefiguring one of the most influential ideas in 20th century literary criticism, that of the intentional fallacy or death of the author, where the worth and meaning of a writer lie with the reader rather than the author. And this is true. एक लेखक अपने जाने के बाद या तो जीवित रहता है या ख़त्म हो जाता है. जीवित भी पाठकों की वजह से रहता है अगर उनके पाठक उनको अप्रिशिएट करते हैं, पसंद करते हैं, बार बार उनकी पोइम्स या रिटन वर्क को पढ़ते हैं, तो लेखक जिंदा है, जीवित है। और अगर पाठक उनकी लेखनी को पसंद नहीं करते, तो वो राइटर स्वतः ही उनको भुला दिया जाता है एंड उनकी एक्चुअल डेथ हो जाती है। Auden says that the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. We cannot help but change the meaning of what a poet wrote, adapting it to suit out our times and our own feelings. Auden concludes this first section in memory of W.B. Yeats by acknowledging that the world will go on tomorrow, but a few thousand will think of the day Yeats died as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. There is a refusal to indulge in sentimental public mourning here, something that also underscores the surprising origins of Auden's most famous poem, which had its roots in parody rather than sincere elegy, and a classical downplaying of the importance of Yeats's death. It is important and noteworthy, but it is like a day on which one does something out of the ordinary, that is slightly extraordinary, rather than a dramatic day that changes everything. Part 2. In the second section of In Memory of W.B. Yeats, Auden turns to address or apostrophize the dead Yeats directly. Apostrophize means to talk directly to somebody. You were silly like us, he says, and in a single stanza of 10 lines, utilizing para rhyme, all still decay, poetry survives, executives, grief survives, and one including full rhyme, south and mouth, Auden begins to turn away from Yeats in particular to think about poetry more generally. It is here that Auden makes his famous statement that poetry makes nothing happen. It is often analyzed as an admission of poetry's limitations as a tool for social and political change. Indeed, Auden once said in an interview that his poetry didn't help to save a single Jew who was murdered in the Holocaust. Holocaust वो भयावह वक्त है सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर के टाइम के वक्त जब हिटलर ने जर्मनी में जितने भी ज्यूज़ थे उनको ढूंढ कर मार दिया था, कंसंट्रेशन कैंप्स में उनको कैद कर दिया था और लाखों अरबों लोगों ने अपनी जान गंवाई थी, मासूम लोग, केवल इसलिए क्योंकि वो ज्यूज़ थे। और इस विशाल जेनोसाइड जिसको हम कहते हैं, एक साथ जब कई कई लाखों लोगों को मार दिया जाता है, इस विशाल जेनोसाइड को होलोकॉस्ट कहा गया है। बट इज इट एज सिंपल एज दैट? शुड पोइट्री मेक एनीथिंग हैपन? Did Wilfred Owen's war poetry? Did Yeats's own poems? When we analyze this statement, poetry makes nothing happen, in the context of the whole stanza, a more complex and interesting argument emerges. Auden says in the previous line that Ireland has her madness and her weather still, because poetry makes nothing happen. But who in their right mind would expect a poem to change the weather? This is absurd, and deliberately so. Auden is wryly remarking on the failure of poetry to change things. But this is not quite the cry of despair and powerlessness it is often taken for. After all, as Auden goes on to say, poetry survives in a whole host of places. And although it does not make anything happen, it is itself a way of happening. Emphasis is added here. Not something that makes history happen, but part of history itself, perhaps, and part of life. Part 3. The final section of In Memory of W.B. Yeats is written in regular quatrains of trochaic tetrameter catalectic, that is, with the second half of that fourth and final foot lopped off, rhymed AABB. Having addressed the burial of Yates, Auden concludes by addressing the shade of the dead Yates again. Shade means ghost, asking him to persuade us to rejoice and to heal us with the fountain of his work. The final couplet sees Auden commanding Yeats the poet, for Yeats the man has gone, to teach the free man, the living, to praise and celebrate in the short time allotted to us, the prison of his days, referring to our short life. Throughout In Memory of W.B. Yeats, there is a taut restraint that prevents the poem from spilling over into mawkishness or sentimentality. Auden describes the day of Yeats's death as a dark, cold day. But this is objectively true rather than mere pathetic fallacy or romantic expression. It was cold and snowing maybe on that day. Of course, this does not discount the possibility that Auden feels the day of Yeats's passing to have been cold and dark in a more abstract, even metaphysical sense. But it is also something on which all of the instruments can agree. It was cold and it was dark.